Welcome back to G Fun Facts Online. Today, we are traveling back in time, deep into the heart of Mesopotamia, to rewrite the history of one of the ancient world's most significant cities. We are going to talk about Assur. For archaeologists and historians, Assur is a site of immense reverence. Perched on a rocky promontory overlooking the Tigris River in northern Iraq, this city served as the spiritual and political heart of the Assyrian Empire for over 2 millennia. It was a metropolis where kings were crowned, gods were housed, and the fate of nations was decided. For more than a century, the academic consensus regarding the origins of this great capital was settled. Scholars believe they understood its rise, tracing it to the period of the Akkadian Empire, or the Ur III dynasty, roughly around the 22nd or 21st century BCE. The prevailing narrative was that Assur began as a northern outpost, a peripheral settlement that gradually fell under the cultural and political sway of the more advanced southern Sumerian and Akkadian civilizations. It was thought to be a follower, slowly evolving into the independent power that would one day rule the Near East. But in the winter of 2024, that narrative was shattered. It wasn't changed by a monumental inscription declaring a new king, nor by a trove of gold. It was changed by a layer of sand. Buried deep beneath the ruins of the Temple of Ishtar, the city's most enduring sanctuary, a team of archaeologists from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich uncovered a feature that had eluded excavation for over 100 years. They found a 1-meter-thick deposit of pristine yellow sand. This was not the debris of a flood, nor the accumulation of wind-blown dust. It was a deliberate, engineered foundation, laid down with ritual precision by a society far more complex and ancient than history had given them credit for. This discovery, now known as the Ishtar Sand Layer, has done more than just push back the timeline of Assur's founding. It has forced a radical re-evaluation of the origins of Assyrian civilization, the religious landscape of early Mesopotamia, and the very nature of the relationship between the civilized south and what was often considered the barbaric north. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, we first need to understand the history of the excavation itself. When the legendary German archaeologist Walter André began his work at Assur in 1903, he faced a massive challenge. The site was a tell, a man-made hill formed by thousands of years of continuous occupation. Layer upon layer of mud brick temples, palaces, and houses had been built, destroyed, and rebuilt, creating a complex stratigraphy that reached down dozens of meters. André was a meticulous scholar. His work on the Ishtar Temple remains a foundational text in Near Eastern archaeology. He identified a sequence of temples dedicated to the goddess, labeling them from the most recent, Temple A, back through time, to the archaic Ishtar temples, which he labeled E, F, G, and H. However, the technology of the early 20th century had its limits. As André dug deeper, the stability of his trenches became precarious. The ability to distinguish subtle changes in soil composition faded as the depth increased. He reached what he believed to be the earliest phase, Temple H. This was a modest structure of mud brick. He assumed the foundations of the city lay just beneath it, likely resting on the natural bedrock of the Tigris Bluff. For a century, Temple H stood as the absolute horizon of our knowledge regarding Assur's origins. It was dated, based on pottery and typological comparisons, to the early dynastic period, perhaps around 2400 BCE. But in 2023 and 2024, the Assur excavation project, led by Professor Karen Radner, returned to the site. They came armed with modern geological insight and advanced coring technology. Their goal was simple but ambitious: to see what lay beneath Temple H. Using a mechanical percussion core, a device capable of driving a hollow tube deep into the earth to retrieve a pristine column of sediment, the team drilled through the floor of the ancient sanctuary. What they pulled up was shocking. Instead of the chaotic mixture of ash, broken brick, and clay typical of settlement debris, or the solid limestone of natural bedrock, the cores revealed a uniform, 1-meter-thick band of fine sand. Mark Altaweel, a co-author of the subsequent study, noted that it was immediately clear this was not natural. The transition was too sharp, and the material was too clean. In archaeology, when you see something this distinct and massive, it speaks of intent. The team had found the kisu, a ritual foundation layer. But unlike the reed mats or clay packings found in other sites, this was a massive bed of sand. Carbon dating of charcoal fragments found at the interface between the sand and the first mud brick course of Temple H yielded a date range of 2896 to 2702 BCE. This date is firmly within the early dynastic I period. It instantly adds nearly 500 years to the history of Assur. This means that while the legendary Gilgamesh was said to be ruling Uruk in the south, and before the Great Pyramids were raised in Egypt, Assur was already a thriving city with a monumental temple, capable of organizing the labor and resources necessary to create a sacred foundation for its goddess. But the date was only the first surprise. The second surprise came when the geologists looked at the sand itself. To the untrained eye, sand is just sand. But to a sedimentary geologist, sand is a fingerprint of the landscape. Every grain carries the chemical and physical signature of the rock formation from which it eroded. If the builders of Assur had simply wanted a stable foundation, they could have used the abundant sandbars of the Tigris River, which flowed less than 100 meters from the temple site. That would have been the logical, efficient choice. But when the team analyzed the mineral composition of the Ishtar sand layer, they found something distinct. The sand was rich in epidote group minerals, along with glaucophane, zoisite, and lawsonite. These names might sound esoteric, but their implications are profound. Glaucophane and lawsonite are rare minerals formed only under high-pressure, low-temperature metamorphic conditions. Geologists refer to these as blue schist facies rocks. The crucial detail here is that there are no such rocks in the vicinity of Assur. The geology of the Tigris Valley is dominated by sedimentary limestone and gypsum. The nearest source for these exotic minerals lies 30 to 50 kilometers away to the east, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Specifically, these minerals are characteristic of the Injana Formation and the deposits carried by the Lesser Zab River, a tributary that flows out of the mountains and joins the Tigris south of Assur. This geological forensic work tells us that the builders of the first Ishtar temple organized a massive logistical operation to transport tons of specific sand from a distant source. They likely traveled east to collect this specific material. Why would a Bronze Age society haul sand over such a distance when the Tigris was right there? The answer lies in the realm of the sacred. In the ancient Near East, the construction of a temple was a cosmological act. The temple was the literal house of the deity. It could not stand on profane ground, meaning earth that had been walked upon or dirtied by daily life. The ground had to be purified. In southern Mesopotamia, in the great Sumerian cities like Uruk and Nippur, it was common practice to lay down a foundation of clean sand to create a tabula rasa, a blank slate for the god. This sand wiped the history of the site clean. The builders of Assur were clearly aware of this southern tradition. By adopting the sand foundation, they were signaling their participation in the high culture of Mesopotamian urbanism. However, their choice of material signals a distinct, local identity. They did not import sand from the holy cities of the south. Instead, they looked east, to the mountains. To the people of the Assyrian plains, the Zagros Mountains were not just a source of stone and timber. They were a landscape of power, the abode of wild, untamed forces. By bringing the mountain sand to the banks of the Tigris, they were physically grounding their temple in the power of the highlands. This synthesis perfectly encapsulates the emerging identity of Assur. It was a hybrid civilization, using a southern ritual form but executing it with northern, mountain materials. The structure that rose upon this precious bed of sand, Temple H, was the first in a long lineage of sanctuaries. It followed the bent axis plan common in early Mesopotamian shrines, where a worshipper would enter through a side door and turn 90 degrees to face the deity, creating a sense of intimacy and mystery. But who was the deity worshipped here in 2900 BCE? In the south, she was Inanna, the Queen of Heaven. In the north, however, the religious landscape was influenced by the Hurrians, a people who inhabited the arch of the Fertile Crescent. Their great goddess was Shaushka, a deity of war and healing often associated with mountains and lions. The Ishtar of Assur was likely a syncretic figure from the very beginning. The presence of the mountain sand strongly suggests a link to Shaushka and the highland traditions, while the architectural form points to Inanna. Thus, the archaic Ishtar was a goddess of the borderlands, holding the civilized powers of the Sumerians in one hand and the martial power of the Zagros Mountains in the other. As centuries passed, the temple grew, mirroring the rise of Assur itself. Layers G and F, dating to the early dynastic III and Akkadian periods, show expansion with thicker walls and larger courtyards. Votive offerings from this period include statues of worshippers with wide, staring eyes, identical to those found in the royal cemetery of Ur. This proves that by 2500 BCE, Assur was fully integrated into the shared culture of Greater Mesopotamia. Later, in the Old Assyrian period, the temple was enriched by the profits of the tin and textile trade, as Assyrian merchants established colonies as far away as central Turkey. By the Middle and Neo-Assyrian periods, kings like Shalmaneser III rebuilt it with baked bricks and glazed tiles. Yet, despite the grandeur of these later phases, they all rested on that first, invisible layer of yellow sand laid down in the dawn of the third millennium. This brings us to the broader historical implications. Why does a date of 2896 BCE matter so much? It matters because it challenges the core periphery model of urbanization. For decades, historians believed that the urban revolution began in the south, in Sumer, and that the north was a backwater that only developed cities when southern colonists arrived. The Ishtar sand layer drives a stake through the heart of this theory. If Assur was building monumental temples with complex ritual foundations around 2800 BCE, it was contemporary with the great city-states of the south. It was not a colony, it was a peer. This aligns Assur with other recent discoveries in northern Mesopotamia, such as at Tel Brak in Syria. Excavations there have shown that urbanism in the north began just as early as in the south, but it looked different. These were hollow cities, vast agglomerations of people and herds, structured around different principles than the dense, canal-dependent cities of Sumer. Assur was positioned at a strategic bottleneck of the Tigris. The early dates suggest that the local population recognized this strategic value and organized themselves into a state-level society centuries before the Akkadian Empire. The sand transport implies a centralized authority. You do not move tons of material 50 kilometers for a simple community shrine. You do it because a ruler commands it, and because the community has the surplus wealth to feed the workers. It implies a class of priests who know the rituals, and a class of specialized craftsmen who know where to find the blue rocks in the mountains. In short, it implies a city. This discovery is a testament to the resilience of cultural memory. In later Assyrian texts, the king was described as the steward of the god Assur. The preservation of sacred space was an obsession. The builders of Temple H started this tradition. By laying down that sand, they defined a space that would remain sacred for 3,000 years. Even as empires rose and fell, as the language changed from Old Akkadian to Assyrian to Aramaic, that spot remained the home of the goddess. The sand layer also speaks to a profound connection with the environment. We often think of ancient cities as dominating nature, but the Ishtar Foundation shows a sensitivity to the landscape. They knew the geology of their world. They knew that the Tigris sand was common, and the Zagros sand was special. They mapped their sacred geography onto the physical earth. The work of the Assur excavation project is far from over. New excavations are shedding light on the domestic lives of the common people, and geophysical surveys are revealing the layout of the city's streets. But the Ishtar sand layer will stand as a landmark discovery. It serves as a reminder that archaeology is not just about finding what is visible in the ruins, but about probing the invisible histories hidden beneath our feet. It tells us that the story of civilization is not a monologue spoken by the South, but a dialogue between the river plains and the mountain highlands. Assur, the city that would one day rule from the Nile to the Zagros, began not as a conquest, but as a deliberate pious act of creating a home for the divine, built upon the sands of the mountains. In that layer of yellow sand, we find the grain of truth that rewrites history. Assur was not born of empire. Empire was born of Assur. Thank you for listening to G Fun Facts Online.